a lot of students on liberal campuses, they adhere to certain liberal ideologies, not because they necessarily are super passionate or knowledgeable about what those policies actually consist of, but they just view it as the humanitarian option or, as the option that's morally good. And that stems from a lot of misinformation and a lack of understanding of what conservatives actually believe as well.
Welcome back to Gen Z Unplugged. We have another amazing guest on the show today, Alena, a Luce Center intern. Thank you so much for being here, Alena.
Thanks for having me, Lauren.
Of course. Would you just tell us a little bit about who you are and your background?
Sure, yeah. So my name is Alina. I'm originally from Portland, Oregon, but I actually now live in Nashville, Tennessee for school. I go to school at Vanderbilt University. I'm studying national security and currently have a minor in generative AI and a minor in legal studies as well. I'm just very passionate about conservative principles and policy, and I'm very grateful to be here interning at the Luce Center this summer.
And we're so glad to have you. Okay, I know you kind of have an interesting background growing up in the church setting because your father's a pastor, right? So tell us a
Yes.
little bit about that, about growing up in the church and kind of what your observations were coming from that perspective.
Sure, yeah. So it's hard to sum it up. Obviously, it's a big part of my life. But yeah, I'm very grateful to have been the daughter of a pastor. And I think 10-year-old me would be shocked that those words would be coming out of my mouth because I had a hard relationship with it growing up.
Mhm.
But I think it really just taught me, first of all, just like gave me such a deep appreciation for those who are serving in the church, especially in the role of pastors, not just pastors, but their wives and their families as well. So it's definitely been an instrumental part of my life. But yeah, my dad's been a pastor for my entire life and has been serving in the church for my entire life. Started mostly working with young adults and young professionals. So I growing up was always around just like young adults,
Yeah.
and they were often kind of almost like my friends. So I grew up around people that were a lot older than me, which was very unique, and kind of heard about their struggles and their opinions and their views on politics and their conversations on Christianity and apologetics. So that was very fundamental to my upbringing, was just that having dialogue intergenerationally was really important. But I think it also gave me a really strong grounding in my political beliefs, and viewing that through my identity, which is first and foremost, in Christ and as a Christian. And I'm really grateful for that because I think for a lot of people it can be the other way around. And so having that strong biblical foundation is something that I'm grateful to my parents for instilling in me, that it wasn't ever just like this choice, but it really was something like, no, we are going to church every Sunday. You are not just being passive in the church, but active and actually
Yeah.
serving. So yeah, I'm very grateful for that.
And to you, what did it mean to like live a biblical life, not just going through the motions, going to church every Sunday or every Wednesday night, which I know is common? What did it mean for you to actually live out biblical principles in your life growing up?
Sure. So I think for me, first of all, I mean, I was just always at the church, like from a very tight knit, small community of just Christian believers. So that was really instrumental to me, was seeing how others were in their walk. But I think for me, just growing up, it was always a primary understanding that my life is the Lord's, and that
Yeah.
everything in my life should be, done and committed into His will. And so I think that's always framed everything that I do, whether it's like career or school or education or otherwise, just having that understanding that always coming back to something that my parents have always emphasized in my life, which is just committing things to the will of God, but also I think really carefully examining, is this honoring unto God, and is this, aligned to the will of God? Is this aligned to scripture? And I think just bringing it all back to that has been really foundational in my life, especially. And I've seen that, in college as well, just going to college and being surrounded by just a myriad of Christian ministries, a myriad of beliefs, and lots of people who want to be a mentor figure in my life, and just really being able to navigate that and, frame that against, what does the word of God actually say? And, is this pleasing and honoring unto Him? So.
And when you look at kind of the Christian environment, whether it's growing up in the church or experiencing ministry on campuses, what is the general view of Christians, of the way they look at the world? Like, do you see people who are similar to you and have these conservative values that are, vast majority of the time more aligned with biblical principles? Or do you see people using Christianity to justify more of a leftist worldview?
Sure. So I think for me, honestly, growing up in my family, service was always just a big part of how I grew up and hospitality. So that's a Christian principle that I always saw being lived out constantly in my life. I, like to tell people that my house kind of had this open door
Mhm.
policy. There's was always people in my house, never really, just on the basis of an invitation, but I just always grew up with people being in my house and with my house being a place of prayer, a place where people could fellowship together. So I really grew up seeing that fellowship aspect really lived out in my church at home. Fellowship is a really big part of just Christian lifestyle, and Christian community is really being intentional in having fellowship with other Christian people. So, if someone's in the hospital, if someone's sick, if someone's celebrating a birthday or an anniversary, that community that we always turn to is Christian community and Christian fellowship. And I think that also comes from just being in a family where we don't really have like our actual family living close to us. And so our family really does become the church and the Christian community around us. In terms of politics, though, that wasn't really something that I was necessarily exposed to. I didn't really grow up talking about politics. Or political candidates or otherwise. I grew up, with a clear understanding that there was right and wrong, and that there was a certain structure that God has ordained for, marriage, family, and how we're supposed to live our lives. But certain political issues, I didn't really see that talked about from the pulpit or within the church congregation. I assumed some things to be true and I assumed some things to be false.
Mhm.
But I wouldn't really say that that was something that was always clearly enforced or kind of instruction wasn't really given from that on that from the pulpit itself.
Mhm.
And I definitely see that impacting just leftist ideology, kind of especially among young people in the church. I see that a lot, I think, just because of that lack of clarity from the
Mhm.
pulpit growing up. um, but I think for sure certain issues that Christians seem to have a clear understanding of, whether it's abortion or transgenderism, those things tended to be very communicated very clearly, but
Yeah.
others maybe not so much.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so thinking about how you are now very interested in politics and, want to pursue a career in national security like you said, how when you decided to start getting into that realm, did you think, well, I should be doing this because of my Christian principles? Like that is my motivator? Or what was the thing that motivated you to go from kind of apathetic when it comes to policy and kind of a worldview in that sense to being more gung ho for like getting your conservative values to a higher level and influencing culture?
For sure. So I actually was very liberal from eighth through probably, or from sixth to eighth grade, I would say, just because it was during COVID. The only real political, content that I was being exposed to was, social media. And obviously that is, bias in its own ways. And the algorithm kind of feeds off itself. And I reflect on that experience and just realize that I never had a clear understanding of my faith during that time in my life. I definitely have always known that, the gospel is true and I believe in Jesus, 100%. But that reality that this needs to be lived out and not just something that I believe in the back of my head, I did not have in middle school. Transitioning into high school, I went to a public school in Portland and just began to see like how damaging some of these ideologies are. I saw classmates, transition their genders
Mm.
just like over a short period of time. I also just saw, you know, how I was almost kind of being manipulated, that if I didn't agree with maybe a more liberal ideology, that I would automatically be called like evil or be told that I was, a morally bad person
Mhm.
for just disagreeing with someone or offering an alternative point of view. And so I kind of went through that journey. And then when I came to college, I've always been interested in politics. I love talking about the news and history and foreign affairs and those kinds of things. I got to college and I just continue to see that
Mhm.
complacency, especially in Christian circles, begin to grow when it came to not speaking out about political issues that I viewed primarily as biblical issues. And I was honestly just very tired of that complacency. And I was like, it's time for me to turn this into action and not just, be tired of complacency or be tired of people not talking about things. But if that was going to bother me so much, then I really needed to turn that into action and,
Mm.
be active in standing up for what I knew to be true. So that was kind of my journey. But really just being on the other side of it, I think opened my eyes to so much. I think sometimes when you just are aligned to the same beliefs your entire life, it's hard to really understand what's so appealing maybe about the other side. And
Mhm.
as someone who's kind of been through that transition, that's just made me even more passionate about, pursuing and seeking and advancing the truth.
That's so cool. And that's often how it goes when you're on one side and you flip to the other. You're
Yeah.
one of the most passionate advocates. So that's great. So you kind of hinted at this a little bit, but you go to Vanderbilt,
Yeah.
which is one of the most liberal universities.
Yeah.
And years ago, there was the scandal at Vanderbilt Medical, which caused kind of the beginning of our awareness of all the gender mutilation surgeries. And I mean, Matt Walsh is in Tennessee. And so you
Yeah.
kind of have this general like Nashville, Tennessee environment of these strong conservative advocates, and then you have Vanderbilt's campus. So tell us a little bit about the environment there and how you as a conservative feel and are treated.
Sure. So when obviously I'm from Portland, Oregon, which is, a very different environment than Nashville, Tennessee. When I was applying to college, I applied to 20 plus institutions across the country. I really had no idea where I wanted to end up. I was looking at like rural Texas, or not rural, but, just like in the middle of nowhere in Texas. I was looking up north, northeast, was looking on the West Coast. I did not expect to be in Tennessee, but I think it just worked out and God has blessed me with the amazing opportunity to be at Vanderbilt. But definitely shifting from Portland to Nashville, I thought I was going to be in a much more conservative environment just because it's the South, it's an SEC school. I really
Mm-hmm.
thought that it was going to be a big change from Oregon. And I think definitely, of course, Tennessee is a much more conservative state. The politicians are much more conservative. But honestly, I still struggled the same way that I did in high school at Vanderbilt. I kind of thought when I was applying to college initially that I would find a more conservative community on Vanderbilt's campus. And my freshman year, that's something I really struggled with, where I honestly did not find that. And I just felt very alone in the beliefs that I had. And I totally appreciate and I think respect differences, but I was also just really hoping I would find some conservative community there and didn't really find that. So I would say, even though I thought and expected that to be the case, it really has not been the case. And it's a very diverse school. I think, Vanderbilt obviously gets a lot of Nashville people, but also people from everywhere.
Right.
And so it's not really indicative of maybe the Tennessee environment that I expected.
And have you had any of those kind of typical liberal professor bias situations at Vanderbilt?
Sure, yeah. So I was in my first semester, I was in a class called Core, which is a new Vanderbilt kind of college core curriculum class that we have to take called Being Human. And it kind of fascinated me from the start because I was confused how a university might define what it means to be human or, the central aspects of humanity in like a class that was essentially 2 to 3 months, a one semester class. But, it's a required class that all students have to take. So I took it and, yeah, we had a lot of really interesting questions about politics, about religion, about different things, but I could always tell that my professor was definitely more liberal and just in terms of what she would push. The class was a discussion-based class, and so I went into it thinking, wow, like this is a place where we can debate ideas freely and really talk about different perspectives, but always felt like that professor was pushing our ideas in a certain way. There was a
Mm.
time where she showed a video of I think it was a debate between a few different candidates from the 1980s or the 1990s in America on immigration. And she showed us that video and then proceeded to ask us, what differences we saw between how immigration policy was viewed or kind of how immigration policy was, in the 1980s and 90s
Mm-hmm.
versus today, currently. And she came to the conclusion that, uh, immigration policy today just fundamentally lacks empathy. And there wasn't really room for discussion on, why immigration policy might look different from from the 1980s to 2025, which is when I took that class. It was just kind of a conclusion that was made that today's policy lacks empathy and policy back then did not lack empathy. And that was where we were going wrong. And I left
Mm.
that class and I called my dad immediately and I was like, I can't be in this class anymore. Like, I just don't understand how, why we're not talking about, well, the country has changed a lot since the 1980s, and immigration and the way it works has changed a lot as
Mhm.
well since that time. And it's not so black and white to just label it as a lack of empathy. And so that class was a really big struggle for me because I remember just feeling like I really want to say something, but I don't want this professor to not grade me. I don't want to get a bad grade in the class. It's Vanderbilt. A lot of students really want to maintain a high GPA. And I was also just worried that nobody would talk to me in the class if I actually expressed the views that I had. And yeah, I think it just goes against the fundamental purpose of a university, which is really that, we should be, as students, encouraged to debate ideas and debate different perspectives and not just kind of be told one thing or even have this implicit understanding that certain perspectives won't be tolerated from the get-go. I just think it creates a lot of harm.
And that's the issue with so many universities is they have all of these classes. I mean, the fact that it's called On Being Human.
Yes, yeah, being human, yeah.
I mean, they are so taking the job of parents
Yep,
discipling their children, and
yep,
they're saying, essentially, we're God. We're the ones who tell you what to believe. Here's what to believe about immigration. It's like
yep,
universities have their own Bible, essentially, that
yeah,
they use to indoctrinate people. So it's very disturbing to me when they have classes, A, that exist, and B, that are required for all students
yes.
to take, that answer questions of morality.
Mhm.
Just freaky. So, obviously, there's a lot of negatives to being on a liberal campus, but I know you're working on potentially writing an article about a defense of a liberal campus.
Yeah.
So, tell me about the inspiration for that and what your intention is there.
Sure, yeah. So my first semester at Vanderbilt, there was a lot of political discussion. Uh, Vanderbilt received the Compact for Academic Excellence that the Trump administration had sent to a few schools, where, within that compact, there were several terms. It mentioned, increased protections for conservative students. It also mentioned explicitly defining gender as binary, and that kind of played a role in terms of, the Trump administration offered this to Vanderbilt and several other schools. And, I think kind of promised an increase in funding or something of the sort if the school were to say yes to the terms. And what's interesting is that a lot of schools initially flat out said either yes or no, but Vanderbilt decided to essentially make a claim that was a little bit unclear, which was that they would just continue to work with the Trump administration on this compact, but never really gave a flat out yes or no. And
Mm.
that caused a lot of controversy among professors. There was a protest outside my dorm room, actually, by graduate students, professors, and undergraduate students, protesting that the university didn't give a flat out no to Trump's compact. And so that really got me thinking just about, I think as much as it's great to and amazing to be in environments like this where I'm surrounded by other conservative women that I can really learn from and just be able to grow in our beliefs together and also challenge each other's beliefs at times, but just be able to be really grounded and rooted in, similar understandings of truth. I think that's so wonderful and beautiful and honestly very biblical as well to have intergenerational mentorship. But for me, being on a liberal campus, I've also just really been able to kind of understand how students on many of these campuses view different issues. A lot of students on liberal campuses, they adhere to certain liberal ideologies, not because they necessarily are super passionate or knowledgeable about what those policies actually consist of, but they just view it as the humanitarian option or, as the option that's morally good. And that stems from a lot of misinformation and a lack of understanding of what conservatives actually believe as well, which is interesting to me. And so being on this campus, I'm able to talk to people like that on a daily basis. I'm able to really reason with them. And of course, some people don't want to reason with you, and that's a different camp. But I'm able to really ask them, like, hey, why do you believe what you believe? And I don't think I would be able to do that to the same extent if I was on a campus that was more conservative.
Mhm.
And so I really appreciate that. There are times this past year where I've called my parents or I've been like, I wish I went to a campus that was more conservative. I wish I went to a private Christian school. But I'm just also very grateful to be on the campus that I'm, on because I'm really able to see how people are processing these important issues in real time and make that change directly, rather than just kind of having complaints about other issues, but really being able to face that directly on a campus, I think gives you a whole different perspective.
Yeah, it definitely does. Because I went to Virginia Tech and same experience of I'm very grateful that I could put myself in the shoes of people who think completely opposite that I do.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a real asset actually to the conservative movement. And a lot of the time, I mean, yes, there's the crazy radicals, but there's a lot of just kind of
Yeah.
average, normal people, like especially women I can think of who are just trying to do the empathetic thing, the
Yeah.
kind thing, whatever. And they just have a really twisted understanding of what that is supposed to look like. So I think that that's really great. I'm excited to see the op-ed on that.
Yeah.
All right. I want to talk a little bit about tech because I think our audience is unfamiliar with this. We did an episode about crypto. We'll have
Oh,
an
cool.
yeah,
Yeah.
so go ahead and listen to that one. But
That's awesome.
and we also will be filming an episode on AI later this summer. But I want to hear your impression as being someone who's involved in that world. I know you were a CS major, but you're
Yeah.
minoring in generative AI.
I'm minoring in generative AI. Yeah.
Okay, great. So
Yes.
let me hear your impression about why conservatives specifically, though we love our tradition, which is great. We love our founding principles, but why is it important for us to also be up to date on tech and aware and savvy of all the changes that are happening there?
Sure. So I think for me, primarily, I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding in terms of, what conservatives actually believe. And I think conservatives have never been, resistant to progress in certain areas, but it's more just also been about, how can we sustain our underlying traditions, and, that permeance kind of, while also being able to apply that to, ways that we move forward and ways that we progress in society, because that's inevitable and that will happen. And I know within the conservative movement, there is a sector of people that are maybe more wary of artificial intelligence and technology, and that is extremely understandable. It's not just among conservatives; it's among a lot of people in the country that are just scared of something new. I often use this analogy about the calculator and how there were worries about maybe what the calculator would do in terms of our critical abilities and our ability to you know perform a certain task for ourselves, by ourselves without the use of an external tool. Whereas, now at this point in time, that tool has not become something that's viewed as maybe taking away our critical thinking, but it's been able to be sort of used in a way that can help us be more efficient. So, yeah, in terms of how I view AI, I think it's something that conservatives need to have a view on. I'm very interested in the current conservative AI policy debates that are going on in terms of, as conservatives believing in a free market environment, and, wanting to innovate and create, and how we balance that with
Mhm.
AI regulation. So I'm very interested in that, and I think it's important that we as conservatives create a strong approach to AI and how we're going to continue to foster innovation while also kind of having a clear understanding of where we want to regulate. So that's something that's very interesting to me, and I love talking to people about that. But also, I think just among young conservative women,
Mhm.
especially that are especially going to maybe schools that are more in the classical tradition or otherwise, from what I've seen in my own personal perspective, there seems to be a lack of focus on technical tools. And I understand that. I think there's great wisdom in the traditions of the past and the classics. I don't discredit that at all. But I also think for young conservatives, there needs to be a push to get proficient with technologies that are very relevant to our future right
Mhm.
now, to become proficient and understand how AI and how different technologies work. A lot of my friends that are more liberal, that's something that they comment on, is that a lot of conservatives that they meet on different campuses are just unaware of, how some of these technologies really work. And that's obviously a general statement. It's not true for everyone. But I just think as conservatives, I think we have to, there are people that have to take up roles in, the corporate world and education and business. We can't just flee from those spaces. And I think
Mhm.
in order to really be impactful voices in those spaces, we need to learn the technologies that are, going to impact our society the most, and can't just sort of run away from them or say that, we don't feel like learning it, because I think then those environments are going to be taken up by, people who are not conservative, who do understand that technology. So that's why I'm passionate
Mhm.
about it, and I'm very passionate about making sure that students graduate college with hard skills. I think politics is amazing and it's very interesting, but I do think just in the day and age that we're at, to continue making an impact as young conservatives, there needs to be an emphasis on hard skills, even
Mm.
if it's not something that you enjoy or like. I think it just needs to be done. So
Yeah,
yeah.
definitely. It definitely does. There's so much debate about, is college worth it?
Yeah.
But yeah, those hard skills are really important. And like to either even just taking courses, it doesn't have to be even
Doesn't
in
have to be a
college. Like
college
it's never
course. Yeah.
too late to pick up something like
Yeah.
that. And now is such a crucial time because the AI revolution is, I think, going to be even bigger than the internet
Yeah.
revolution. So I want to talk about AI. I was to wrap up a little bit because I know you know a lot and you're very passionate about it. So I think there's kind of three schools of thought when it comes to AI. You have the extreme optimists who are totally embrace it. You have the extreme pessimists who say, I don't want anything to do with it. And then there's the people in the middle who I would describe as maybe like cautiously optimistic. So where do you fall on that scale and what are the reasons for that?
Sure. I think I'm definitely somewhat in the middle. I am a very big proponent of learning what this technology is. Like, what does it actually do? What kind of information is it taking in?
Mhm.
How is that being outputted? How do these systems actually work? I am a big proponent of that, of just understanding what are we even working with, and how is this even being developed. But in terms of its uses, I am very cautious about a lot of those things. I think, first of all, using AI to completely replace, things that are critical to our ability to think critically as humans and to actually use the brain that, God has blessed us with. I'm very wary of that. And I see that going the wrong way already among so many young people. So I'm very wary of that. A lot of people are also turning to AI as their, mental health assistant. Some people are even, entering romantic relationships with AI. Those things are very concerning. So I think where I stand is, we need to have an understanding of what this technology is and what it actually does and how it can be used in ways that can make us more efficient and productive. And that looks different for everybody. And just having an understanding of what are we even engaging with. But I am very wary of, how it's being used to really substitute parts of people's lives in ways that it really shouldn't be.
Yeah, the AI therapy is one of the
Yeah.
scariest things to me, and I know there's been lawsuits surrounding that. So we're working out all of these really major ethical questions with this, and I think it's hard for the ethics to keep up with the progress of the technology. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how policy develops surrounding that. All right, we have a couple minutes left. So one thing I want to ask you to end is if you could go back in time and talk to the Alina who's graduating high school, you're going to Vanderbilt, you're a conservative.
Yeah.
What is like a piece of advice that you would give yourself that would be so helpful for you now? Because I'm thinking of all of the people in our audience who are in that stage of life of going into college. And some of them, yes, they're going to those, typical schools like Hillsdale, which are amazing programs and really conservative. But then there's a lot like you who are going into these secular campuses.
Yeah.
So what would you tell the younger version of you?
Sure. Well, I think firstly, I would just tell my younger self to remain rooted and grounded in the Word of God. I think that's so important. I think there's a difference between actually being rooted and grounded in that versus thinking you are. And that was something that a trap that I fell into all the time. So I would say number one, so you can always have that as a lens to view problems that you face on your campus and even advice that you get from people that might, be mentors that you look up to, but really being able to take that advice that they give you and examine that against, the Word of God and what that
Mm.
says. I think the other advice would just be to find a church and be able to just plug into that and not just the church that everyone else is going to or the church that your friends are going to, but really examining what does this church believe and then being able to be, plugged in there and serve and not just be a passive participant as a college student in your church, but being active in that. Those are the two pieces of advice I would give. And just being careful with mentors. I think mentors are great, but I think in college there's a lot of people that want to be your mentors. And I think
Mhm.
just being able to identify a few people that you can go to consistently and be mentored by rather than lots of mentors who want to have an opinion on things in your life that maybe don't even align to your values and beliefs is really important to have that discernment when it comes to that. So
I think it's exactly what you said. You have to examine it against the Word of God
yeah.
and do these things line up. So that's amazing. Thank you so much, Alina. We're excited for this episode to come out
Thank
for
you.
everybody to
Yeah.
see this. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Lauren.